Hello, I'm Serena Calandra or Calandra, and I'm going to show you how to do needle felting. First, I just want to talk about there's a couple different types of needle felting. You have flat felting, often sometimes referred to as wool painting, depending on what you're doing. And then we have three-dimensional felting or needle felted sculptures. And this is just a simple little mushroom, but there's a lot that you can do with this. The first things that you need when you're getting started is you do need to have a block of foam or a wool block. This wool block was purchased on Amazon with a kit that came with the needles and some other little handy tools. This is just open cell foam. I would recommend having at least a 2-inch piece. If you have it less than 3 inches, you definitely want to have something under it in case the needle goes all the way through the foam. Then you need to have your needle felted needles or needle felting needles. They come in a variety of sizes, gauges, and types. Generally, you're looking at wanting one that's kind of for coarse and one for fine, at the very least, having two different ones. Generally, 38 and 40 gauge, I believe, is what you would be looking at. If you're shopping at local hobby stores, you may find a particular brand that they come in a pink package or a green package. And the pink one is a good all purpose. If you're just doing flat felting, then that's usually fine. If you're doing a lot of fine detail work or the sculptures, you do also want to have a fine needle to be able to go over those details. They do also come in other sizes and types that are star shaped, spiral. And as you advance, you can look more into those different types and they may help you depending on what it is you're trying to do. I find usually for most things, I just need a fine and a coarse needle and I'm good. I have 3 sizes right here that came with the kit and they're working out pretty well here. It is good to have extra needles because they do break, so you want to be very careful. These are very sharp and they're triangular shaped. They have little barbs on them. So think of like a fishing hook, only it's straight. So you really do not want this going into your skin, so be very careful. Something that some people will use for protection is if you're doing the three-dimensional, you may want to use a thimble or these little leather finger cots. Also came in the kit that I got. Now, I'm going to tell you the needles could still probably go through here, but if it's just a little poke on the end, it'll help protect your fingers a little bit. There are also various needle holders that you can get. This one holds a single needle. You just take the little part out and slide the needle in and then put it back in. Some people like this for control. You can buy tools that hold multiple needles. I've seen from 3 to 5 that can fit in one. If you're doing a large area of flat felting, that is usually good to have a multi-needle tool that'll go faster. And then you have your wool that you would need. Now, there's different types of wool, many different types of sheep out there that you can use. Some are better than others for different purposes. Most of the colored wool I have right now is merino, which is very soft. And if you have a lot of wool sensitivities and allergies, merino is usually a good one to use because it doesn't have the same properties as a lot of the wool that you think of as the itchy, scratchy wool. Now, with that in mind, though, it also takes longer to felt. It will felt well, but it's very soft and it takes a little bit more work to get it to work. What I recommend doing is starting with a core wool if you're going to be doing a three-dimensional sculpture. And when you look through other videos and they may reference a core wool, there's different types that they could be referring to. What I have here, this white, is Cheviot. I also use Polworth and Jacob. They're a little bit coarser than the merino and they felt together very fast. You can also find them a lot cheaper. The Cheviot I have found I buy it by the pound. because I also do spinning, so it's useful for that too. And making wet sheets of wet felt, such as this dragon, I made the sheet of felt with the Cheviot. And what a lot of people will do with the needle felted sculptures is that they'll make the base parts of the sculpture out of the core wool and then wrap the places that they want to have color with that color on top of it, which is what I did with this mushroom. So it was made out of the white first, and then I added the red on top of it so that you're saving the more expensive colored wools for just the smaller pieces. But you can make it entirely out of merino if you'd like. It just may take a little bit more wool and time with that. I'm just getting some basics on what you need to get started. Now, as far as what you want your base to be, because we're going to look at the 2D felting for the moment. This is craft store felt that I've pre-sewn into a belt paper for medieval groups. This is acrylic, polyester. They make it out of lots of things. You can felt wool onto it with the needles. You can also use wool felt, which is harder to find, but you can use 100% wool. There's wool blend felts, but those tend to be really stiff and they're very difficult to actually get the wool to adhere to it, but you can make it work. You can also felt onto fleece. You can felt onto linen. You can felt onto wool fabric. Some people with linen, they will put it in an embroidery hoop and then put the foam underneath it and use it that way. And it's kind of an alternative to embroidery. And if you're a member of various medieval organizations, this is not a period craft. However, it can mimic period details on things. From 10 feet away, it looks like embroidery. I have also seen people needle felt onto hats and boots, make it look similar to things that you would see in various nomadic cultures, especially that would have been found around the steppes and such. And that's a good way to get some detail into it instead of wet felting it in using the needle felting afterwards. But it can also just be something to do for fun, to add in things. I had intended this to be a needle book eventually. There's a lot of different detail that you can add with this. So we're going to look at the basics of how to get started here. So I have my piece of felt. And the wool you may see referred to as comb top or wool roving. It can also be found in little individual bags at craft stores with just some tufts of a color. You can buy it by the ounce or by the pound. Generally, if you're just getting started and want a little sampling, some of the kits that have just like a little ounce or half ounce of various colors is good for starting for flat felting. If you're wanting to do needle felting sculptures, you're going to want a little bit more on that. But you grab some wool and you just tear off a piece. You don't want to cut it because that will affect the fibers. What I like to do is start with just a small amount. You really don't need a whole lot. And then just kind of tear it a little bit around to make a little bit of a cloud. Because you want the fibers going in different directions. It'll make it easier. The very basic concept of this is you're just poking the wool fibers into your base fabric. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start poking it where I want it. I have a little bit down right there. So after I've poked it a few times, I'm going to pull up the fabric. You see how it's starting to go behind a little bit. As you go over it, the fibers will start to bind on the back like this. And that's why we call it needle felting, because they're felting together. Now, if you don't pull up your fabric every now and then, it will start adhering to the layer underneath, to your foam or your wool block. Some people will use thick brushes, but I haven't had much luck with that. So I like the foam or the wool block. So you can start controlling the shape with the needle or how you have the wool. So I'm going to start curving this upward a little bit. So I'm holding it like that. So I'm going to start poking around a little bit to form my shape. Do you want to go slow? You don't want to go so fast that you end up hitting your fingers. Just be very careful. Let's show it a little bit here. So I'm going to use the needle to poke in a little bit and try to help form my shape. So I still have this loose part up here. So I'm going to start working on that. And this needle is actually being a little coarse for that right now. So I'm going to switch my needle. It wasn't liking how dense the fabric was. So I'm making kind of a little bit of a C, but just playing around with the shapes. You can see the needle marks in there. The more that you go over it, the finer you can get with the details. But that's the basics for getting started with the flat felting. You can add colors on top of it, like you saw with the dragon. There's many different things you can do with this. You can be realistic or just something completely abstract, whatever you want to do with it. Now, if you wanted to add some detailed lines, then what I do is I take a little bit of the wool and my hands are going to turn in opposite directions. I'm twisting the ends to go in opposite directions from each other. This is a little difficult. I'm going to take it in the middle there. And it kind of twists up a little bit like a piece of yarn. And that just makes it easier for putting a line down. You can also use some thin yarn. If you have some wool sock yarn, especially if you have any single ply yarn, that is something you can also use with this. But twisting it up a little bit helps with being able to get the line in, to be able to make an outline for something or to felt a small area. Just kind of poke that in. You can start making a little line. Kind of resembles chain stitch a little bit, depending on how you poke it. And the more that you work it, the tighter that it'll be. You can also end up poking things all the way through. So you do want to be careful and not make a hole. Now, if you don't like how something's going, if you haven't gone over it too much, you can gently pull it out a little bit to undo things. So that's how you can try to fix a mistake or put it in a different area that you want or where you want to go. There are different things that you can use to put your pattern down on the fabric. One is you could just freehand it. You can take a Sharpie. You just have to make sure that you're going to cover your edges. You can place a stencil directly on your fabric and felt just with the stencil on. But if you feel like it's going to move around a lot, you could use a stencil and then draw something onto the fabric. Cookie cutters also work well. So some different ideas. If you have a cutting machine, you can, such as a Cricut, you can always make stencils with that. Now, there is another way of flat felting that will also help with incorporating things into the needle felting sculpture. you can take your little clump of wool, as we started out before, but this time I'm just going to lay it flat. And this is where a multi-needle tool would come in handy. If you just start poking around a little bit and then pull it up and just start poking around a little bit all over. You don't want to work in just one place for a while because that's where you'll just push it into the foam. You can turn it over and go from the other side. So this works if you're making a dragon and you want to make wings. This is a good way to start a wing, because now I've started to make a tiny little sheet of felt. Now what I would do for with something like this, if I was adding it to a sculpture, is after I got it how I want it to be with the needle felting, I would take a little bit of hot water and soap and use the friction around your hands, or if you have a little bit of nylon netting to put in between, and that's how you make wet felt. But cleaning it up with the hot water and soap will felt it even farther, provided you're using wool that can felt, and that will give you a sturdier piece to add on to things. Now, what I said about providing you're using wool that can felt, there are wools out there that will say they are superwash, and especially if you're using a yarn, it may say that. And superwash cannot be wet felted. It can be felted with needles, but the hot water and soap won't do anything to make it stronger or to clean it up at all. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at wools and what you have access to and what you're wanting to do. But that's the starting of the flat felt. Now, as far as the 3D felting, we will be covering a little bit more with that with the next video.